Welcome everybody, and welcome to number 3 in the 2019-09 launch party. My name is Gentleman, and I'll be helping out with this webinar. And John Devlin, he is the star of the show, and he will be presenting the other key topics of the new launch of this series. If you have any questions during today's session, feel free to post them in the questions channel. We will be there to answer them. And with that out of the way, let's get started, John.
Okay, Jan. One more time, I want to show the picture of the beautiful Movenpick Hotel and remind everyone Servoy World is fast approaching. We're going to give some details towards the end of the webinar about this when we take question and answer. With that out of the way, I'd like to welcome everyone to the third in this series, launching Servoy version 2019-06. This is our third quarter launch of the year, and we're excited to bring you all of the content because this launch is packed with a lot of content. Last one we showed was on Wednesday. It was all about building hybrid desktop applications. If you missed that, the recording is already available. This one will also be recorded in case you want to rewatch it. This topic is about web services, and in particular how to set up your own web services, so not connecting or consuming web services, but producing your own web services. We did a webinar on this, I think it was number 17, so quite a little while ago, but it's there in our archives. So I recommend, if this topic is of interest to you and you haven't seen that webinar, watch that recording after you watch this, because this is sort of like part 2 of that, because we added some functionality in the latest release that extends what you can do. So I'm going to do a little bit of a recap, but I'm not going to do a full in-depth about how to do web services in Servoy. I'm going to just sort of build upon that. But I'll do a quick recap and show what's capable and kind of go over a few things, and then we'll jump into what's new. So what I'm going to be showing you in terms of the new stuff is we've added support for versioning your APIs. We've added support for top-level scopes as opposed to just form scopes. We've added support for doing deeper endpoints, so being able to do more custom stuff in how you construct your URLs and how you handle those endpoints. And then I'm finally going to show you a cool extension that is sort of in the labs right now for automatically generating documentation for your API. So as always, we like to jump right into the demo with this webinar, and then afterwards we do some slides and recap. I am going to switch over to a tool that I like to use called Postman. It's a web services testing tool. There are some other ones out there. Some old-fashioned folks like to use curl. So anyway, that's what I'll be using to send requests to my example web services. And the first thing that I'd like to do is run a quick hello world web service and sort of show you how that's set up, because it literally takes minutes to set up a web service in Servoy. So I'm going to send a request to my local app server, which is always running in background when you run Servoy Developer. And you can see that the response was hello world. Maybe I'll adjust it with a parameter and do hello Sean, hello world Sean. And you can see that that was replaced world with Sean, Jan, etc. You get the point. So a simple web service takes an argument, returns a message. Let's take a look at how that's set up. I'm going to switch to the Servoy IDE. And this is actually the exact example I showed way back when we did the first version of this webinar. Here we have a bunch of a group of forms, and each form is its own sort of mapped resource or endpoint. And so I have the hello world, and I implemented a method called WSRead. Now, the method WSRead is a particular naming convention that maps to the HTTP GET verb at that endpoint. So if I do get hello world, it calls WSRead. There are other verbs and other conventions to map to that. So you can see that then the argument name was what I had passed in. If I didn't pass it, it just uses world. Otherwise, it substitutes that in and it returns a message. That message is automatically serialized back as JSON for the response. So pretty easy to set this up. Literally, all you have to do is make this resource, this form, and you can run with it. Some other things that I'd like to recap is just some best practices or typical capabilities. So I'm going to request another endpoint orders. And you can see that the response is a list of order records. You can also see that there's a page number here. And if I go down, you can see the page size is 10. So a bit of pagination available there. We can request multiple pages. We can even change the page size. So, and I believe that is, let's just make it smaller. So now you can see, I didn't do my parameter right. But let me take you under the hood and look at that get, and then we'll get the right parameter for the page size. So I'm going to my, my orders form, and you can see that the WS read here is actually implemented in a base form API base. So I've used a bit of form inheritance to extend that. And then pretty much this has default logic that I'm using for any of those endpoints. So if I did orders or customers or products, it's actually going to just run through this. And I didn't write any specific logic around orders. And it's just returning all the fields that it can for that particular database table. If I look for the page size with an underscore, so there you go. So now you can see that I've limited the page size to 1. It will change it. I can also let's put the page back to whatever the default was. I think it was 10, but we'll go to page 2, and you can see that that is on page 2 here, and the results would be the next batch in that list. Some other things that we can do, we could, let's do a different table just for fun. We could do customers, and well, let's stick to orders because I actually know an order ID off the top of my head or in my history. So orders, and I put in an order ID. So instead of getting a list, I've requested a specific order by ID. Some other things we can do is we could ask to include a bit of related information. So I'm asking for, in this case, the order details. And you can see that in addition to the regular fields, it has here an array of the details in there. None of the functionality I'm showing you is necessarily required or even out of the box. It's quite easy to do. But these are some common conventions in a web service, and I just wanted to show you that it's possible and easy to do and a little bit how it was done. Again, this is a bit of a recap. This is not new stuff. I'm going to get to the new stuff in a minute. Some other things you might want to do is to, well, we can add related information about the customer as well. So now you can see here's the customer info down here. Let's go back to our list, and let's specify that we just want to limit the fields, and we want I don't know, ship country, and maybe ship city. So now you can see that I'm limiting the fields, and maybe I also want to add a filter, and I want where ship country equals Germany, but I'll still limit my fields with that parameter. And so now you can see that all of the orders here are German orders, but the fields are still limited. So just being able to allow your API users the flexibility to request records in the way that they want. Maybe we want to also do sort equals ship city. I believe that's how you do it. And now you can see that the cities beginning with A are first and going now in order down alphabetically. We could, I think, invert it with a minus. And now you can see that it's going in reverse order, starting with Stuttgart. Again, this was all stuff that I had demoed in the long ago webinar. None of this is yet brand new. What I do want to point out, though, is that everything that was passed in was really in the arguments there. The first one is the ID, and then there's the query string, and then I'm just sort of parsing the query string here. And this is a utility method I wrote in a base form, so any of these endpoints that I set up without writing any additional code will implement some of the pagination and the filtering and the sorting and restricting the fields, including related records, etc. I think I don't want to go too deep into how this was done because there's new stuff to show with 2019, and that's what this webinar is all about. So what I'd like to do is come back here and show you version 2 of the Hello World. So I'm going to go back to my Hello World example, and I'm going to stick a v2 in front of the Hello World in my URL. This one wants a, I'll put my name there, wants a name. Okay, so now you can see it says, hello Sean, welcome to version 2. Let me take you under the hood and show you how that was supported, because this is new. And there's actually two things that I'm going to show you that are new here. First of all, you'll notice that I've implemented a few scopes, including Hello World v2 and a WSRead method in there. And this is where that was implemented. So nothing different except for two things. Number one, scopes are now supported. The REST plugin has been in Servoy since way long ago, even before we had what we call these top-level scopes. So everything was sort of segmented by form, and that's how you mapped a resource. Also nice because forms already had a dedicated found set, so it made loading a bit simpler. Also, forms support inheritance, so you can do things like what I did, where I put everything in API base, and all the other endpoints sort of inherited that functionality. So I'm not saying that forms are old and scopes are new and you should use scopes. I'm saying now you have the flexibility, and if you have some some different stuff that you want to implement in scopes, you're free to do so, and you can mix it up. So what I did here is I implemented hello world underscore v2 as a scope, and the REST plugin is smart enough to recognize the v2, and if you can call it what you want, but it'll sort of find that in the URL and look for something that has that appended to the end of the resource. So that's how I get hello world v2 in this example. I want to do another example here. This time we'll do orders v2, and I want to do adding an endpoint that goes a little bit deeper. So I already showed you how we can get orders. We could also do a version 2 of that, but let's say I want to add an item to an order. In this case, I'm going to add it to order 10249, and I want to add a new product and specify the quantity. So I'm calling AddItem. This time it's not just a post or a get, but it's also doing some specific method. So I'm going to send that, and you can see that it returns the response, and in there it has the order details, or the line items for this order, and you can see product 50 there has a quantity 40. It's because it already had 30 when I started. So I'm going to call this one more time, and you should see it should go up by another 10. So a bit of arbitrary business logic, but just to show. So there you go, product ID 50, now quantity 50. I could change the payload here and make the quantity 100, and now it should go up by another 100. So now you can see the quantity is 150. So you get the idea. But what I want you to understand about this is that this add item section of the URL is now seen not necessarily as an argument, but as a route to a method under that specific resource. And we added this because this is a common REST convention. You have sort of these mapped resources like customers, orders, these entities in your system, And then you maybe want to do the typical CRUD stuff, which is, post and put and get in terms of HTTP verbs, but you also might have custom stuff that goes beyond that, in this case, like adding an item to an order, and you want to express that as a separate method. So let's look at the method that was implemented. Again, this time I put orders v2 as a scope. I could have done it as a form. I could do it as a form that inherits from orders base here, or version 1. But in this case, I did it as a scope to show you can do those top level scopes. And then I have this method ws create and then underscore add item. So again, it's looking at the URL. The REST plugin is smart enough to know that add item appears under one of the REST handler methods for that resource, and it routes it that way. And what it does, any of the puts or posts will always put the payload, the body of the request is the first argument. And then if you're routing this to a method, it'll actually pass the method name in as another argument. In most cases, you can just ignore that. And then finally, it's whatever arguments or query stream come after that. In this case, it was just the order ID. So I just find the order that I'm looking for, and if it already exists, I just locate it. Otherwise, I'm adding that line item, and then I increment the quantity. So that's why the first time it'll actually add the line item. The next time it'll just keep incrementing the quantity. And then what I'm doing is just for the sake of the example, I'm calling down here the first version of this to just serialize the response back, that record back, because that didn't really change. But what I really wanted to point out here is that this method signature is custom add item, and that is a new URL path there. So that's kind of what's new so far in terms of the REST plugin functionality. It's those three things: scopes, versions, and deeper endpoints. And I think that's a satisfactory example. I wanted to leave time to show you another neat thing we're working on, which is a documentation generator. For this, what I'm going to do is activate another solution that I have here called Sui Example API. And this is a much sort of simpler example. And you can see that it has two endpoints. It has a store and a pet. So this is a pet store sort of example. And you can see that store has a WS create for handling posts, and a read inventory, which is one of those mapped methods. And then it also has a form for the pet itself, and quite some REST methods there. Let's just jump into one of these and look at some of the tags that are here. For example, the read object, or the read method, has some documentation, and it has these tags in it: the summary, the parameter, the different return types. You may notice that there's an enum tag here. You may notice a deprecated tag here on the find by name. So what we've done is a colleague of mine made a neat module that he was working on with the customer that's already in production with this documentation generator, and they wanted to be able to use a tool called Swagger UI to visualize and test their API. I'm going to reload this page here. So you'll notice the URL here is the same endpoint as what would be how I request, except that it goes to the swagger.json, which is like a descriptor. And then what it does is it runs this module that is able to go in and parse or read those WS underscore methods, as well as the endpoints where they exist, so those scopes and those forms, and it's able to generate out the documentation. So you can see here that pet was a form, and it had those different, WS create, WS update, WS read, and WS delete methods get converted into these HTTP verbs. You'll notice that the description, like add a new pet to the store, if I go back to the WS create method of method, you'll see the summary tag here, add a new pet to the store. I could put in add a brand new pet to the store and save that. And if I were to come back here and refresh the documentation, you can see that the summary there, add a brand new pet to the store, was updated. So it's live. Whatever is in source is just being generated from that. This wasn't pre-compiled or anything like that. You can see that this one here shows is deprecated, find pets by tag, and you can see that, or find pets by name, I mean. You can see the deprecated tag right here, and that will render it as such. You could probably add another message here, like use something else. And if I come back and do this, I think I thought it would put that in there while I went off script. This is a work in progress, so we're getting the module here a little bit refined, but these key tags are supported. Finally, what I want to point out is that one enum tag. If you look at the top of this, we have this enum tag on this status, and farther down, you can see, for example, read find by status, one of those custom endpoints. It specifies that it takes an array of those enum objects. And if I were to come back here to the generated documentation and find by status, you can see that there is one of these list boxes here that show you how to do it and what's an acceptable value to pass. This tool, Swagger UI, you can even test out your endpoints. So I'm going to click try it out, and I'm going to execute. And you can see that it didn't like that I didn't supply this because it's marked as required. So I'll put in pending and I'll put execute. And it gives some information about what was sent. You can see the response was handled code 200. Here's the response body. Here's all the headers. So not only does this automatically generate documentation for this particular tool, this tool is also a testing tool. So you could set up a sort of sandbox account, point the documentation generator to it, and then release this to your customers, and they could actually go and read the documentation and try it out. So it's quite useful. Again, here you could do find by ID, try it out. I don't know the ID, so I probably get, well, I got lucky. I found one with ID 1. Good guess. But you get the idea. So if you're not familiar with this tool, you can read up on Swagger UI, but it generates in this for you. There is a project on GitHub that we just released called Sui API. This is released, if you look at the release notes, this is released in beta because we are still working. There's a few issues. We're adding support for versioning. We do have support for those top level scopes, and we do have support for those deeper endpoints that I showed you that are new, but we're working on support for versioning. We're also working on a couple of issues with warnings that get generated. So we're leaving this as sort of a pre-release for now, but it is now available through the Web Package Manager. So all you have to do is, you can see that there's the Sui API example solution here. It includes this Sui helper module, and you can add that to your own project by running our package manager, and you pick Servoy solutions or modules, and you can see it's right up there, Sui API, and you just click the plus and you can add it to your application. Now there's a few more steps you have to take, but it's really quite easy. And if you go to the wiki page of this project and click the getting started, it'll tell you how to, basically you have to download the Swagger UI and put it out on your web server. That just takes a minute or two. And then there's one file where you have to change one line to map it to your particular application, and then it will go and generate the documentation for you. So that's the demo of the doc generator. Let's just do a quick recap of what we saw. Just for those of you who are brand new to web services and Servoy, this ships by default, nothing to install, no extensions you need to worry about. It just launches a server-side client to handle requests as soon as it does it on a lazy load. So as soon as you first request an endpoint, it launches it and it's running. Simple naming convention to map resources to HTTP verbs. You can do whatever you want in those, but what I tried to show you were some common conventions. And the example solution that I was running is available. We posted that a while ago when I did this webinar before, and it has a nice sort of helper base form that you can do all the stuff that I showed you on any resource. So you can do list, detail, you can do pagination, you can include related records, you can choose which fields you want to return. You can also sort the results. You can add filters. I didn't cover authentication, but there's a couple of authentication schemes. Authentication was covered in the prior webinar more extensively. I want to get to what's new. So first of all, we added support for scopes. So either a form or a scope is then exposed as a mapped resource in your URL convention. And depending on the HTTP verb that gets called, it will call one of those methods that you define, those WS underscore methods. And you can see here which verbs they map to. That hasn't changed. However, you can add versioning now to your API. And if you sort of stick that version number in there, it's kind of smart. You can put it in at the very beginning. You can put it in right before the resource, and the plugin's able to figure it out. And what it does is it looks for that form or that scope, and it looks for an underscore with that version tag, and tries to locate it that way. Something else that was new that we saw, you can actually add a customized endpoint that maps to a specific method, so not just the create, read, update, delete, but also a specific method of your choice. It still has that WS underscore prefix. It also needs the name of the verb that will get called, so create, read, update, delete, because we need to know how to handle the REST verb or the HTTP verb. But then you can add underscore whatever you want, and it'll map that URL to your method, so you can get into some more custom stuff. Finally, what I showed you was a doc generator tool. This is now an extension, so everything that I showed you up until that point is part of Servoy core. You can do that today without installing anything extra, but this is a new extension project that we started. It generates documentation automatically right from your source code, and it uses a tool called Swagger UI, which allows you to visualize and test that. One thing that's neat about that it's generated directly from source code is that it's always up to date. So the same code you use to document your code, the same tags and the same conventions, it will just read those and generate the documentation for you. So if you go and you put out something new on your application server, your documentation is automatically up to date because it's done dynamically. And again, this is really easy to set up. You just include that module. It's available in the package manager. You have to download the Swagger UI stuff and also put it on your web server. And then you just configure, there's a index HTML file. I didn't get into the details of that, but the instructions are there on the wiki. Just modify one URL and a little file, and it points it to your web service to generate documentation for. So I hope that you found the new stuff compelling. A quick list of some of the tags that are supported. I think most notable are those enums and the deprecated tags. Anyway, I'm going to leave up information about Servoy World. It's going to be a lot of fun. We have a hackathon. I think we've been hammering you guys with this, so I'm not going to get into it, but I'll leave up the details here while we take some questions, because I see some are coming in.
And well, actually, Juan started asking a question about versioning, but you answered it a little bit further down the road, so that was done, which is good. And Bob Cusick says that's really helpful, adding endpoints to entities with a naming convention. So it's just a compliment, Sean, today. And looks like everybody else is either very quiet or they really agree with everything that you have said today.
It's unlike the last webinar where we had 30 minutes of questions. So, okay. I wanted to also announce that I'll leave up these useful links for a minute and show you there's the URL for that Sui API project, although you can get it through the package manager. Also links for how you could download, links for signing up for Servoy World. I think there's still some rooms available at the Movenpick. And also links for how to watch a recording of this webinar, or maybe you want to watch the older webinar about the sort of complete webinar about web services, which is still completely relevant.